Well, developing nations are set to bear the brunt of the climate crisis, even though they've contributed the least to emissions responsible for global warming. A case in point, Africa accounts for less than 4% of CO2 emissions. Now, this is all the more consequential for indigenous populations, which often have, of course, a much more direct reliance on the natural environment and its resources. For more, Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim joins me now on set for Perspective. A member of Chad's Mbororo pastoralist community, she also advocates for better inclusion of indigenous populations in the global discussion on climate change. Hindou, thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a great pleasure for having me.
Could you start by telling us both about the Mbororo community and how your experiences led to your activism?
Right. I'm coming from a pastoralist peoples. We are cattle herders, so we follow the rain. When there is rain, there is pasture, and then our cattle can eat because we depend from the meat and the milk. And we are the best solution for this ecosystem because our movement around the place help the ecosystem to get regenerate. And that's what brought me to what I'm doing, because seeing my environment getting degraded, my people getting impacted by the climate change, so I have to stand up and fight.
Climate change, of course, is also a huge part of some of the ongoing conflicts in Chad. Can you talk about the relationship there?
Right. So as peoples depend from all the natural resources for the survival, from the farmers to the pastoralists and the fisher peoples. So they are all depending from these shrinking resources. And when you take the examples of the Lake Chad, who used to be 25,000 kilometers square of fresh water, and now in shrinking 90%. So we have only like 2,000 or 3,000 remain there, and 40 million people living and depending on it. At the end of the day, they just fight each other to get access to the fresh water or to get access to the fertile land. And that is a huge conflict between the communities, and that brought the social cohesion between the families, and it's create also migration for our men who live the communities.
Is the Chadian government doing anything to combat the effects of climate change? Is there even a larger conversation amongst at least the political elite in Chad about how climate change is affecting the country and even the region?
So in Chad, we do have the Ministry of Environment as many other governments around Africa. And then through there is a unity of climate change that are creating documents, of course, as many other countries also, like the National Adaptation Plan, where they can project how they can change the way of productions through agriculture and through farming. But yet, there is no direct project that can impact the communities at the local level. Otherwise, we cannot talk about the climate impact. Everything is ending around the city with the conferences. But when there is a program or project that can go to like my people or other people who are getting impacted, this is not yet arrived.
What's your take on the COP27? Did it do anything to further the needs and demands of indigenous populations, especially given the announcements that were made on loss and damages?
For indigenous peoples, it has been very important to have the loss and damage finally adopted. It is the issue of recognition of responsibility from the developed countries who are the major emitters who take us in this pathway. And then finally, they have to recompensate those who are the most impacted. So this is the first step. But for us as indigenous peoples, we want to have the recognition of non-economic loss and damage. We are not losing our economic way of life, but we are losing our culture, our identity, our land, our places. So that have been very important. But they have to take the responsibility to reduce the emissions.
There's a lot of attention paid to what rich nations can do for developing ones, as we've said, with loss and damage. But what can or are African leaders themselves doing to spearhead efforts? I ask this question because over 100 new fossil fuel projects are being planned for the near future across the African continent. Are African leaders doing anything, or are they doing enough to lead discussions on what changes can be put in place?
Let us be serious and say that African leaders doing talking. They are not acting. Because you cannot talk about the climate impact and seeing your peoples under flood, under drought, under hunger because of the climate change. And without thinking about the fossil fuel, who is the driver of all the climate impact, they must turn to the renewable energy. They must turn to all the just transitions about our development. We cannot take the mistake of the developed world. And developed world actually cannot caution that. All the money that are serving to dig the soil is coming from the bank who are in the developed countries. So that need to stop and let us drive our economy in very carbon neutral way.
Now, speaking of that, in recent years, several African leaders, from Senegalese President Macky Sall to Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni, have called out the West for climate hypocrisy. They say that calling on African nations to jump straight to green technologies while also funding new fossil fuel projects on the African continent to respond to domestic needs in the West is hypocritical. Is it realistic to expect that African nations, where hundreds of millions of people still lack access to basic electricity, can transition immediately to renewable energies?
And that's true. I mean, I'm seeing the hypocrisy coming from the developed world who are funding the fossil fuel in Africa. If the developed world changed the way of having the clean energy in their home, and then they stop funding the fossil fuel and fund directly the renewable, that will be like a little bit just a transition or climate justice that we are calling for. So our leaders are right to say there is a climate hypocrisy. But from themselves also, they have to take their own responsibility. They have to lead by examples, saying that we cannot go into the fossil fuel, but you must pay for the right renewable energy for our peoples. In my community, for example, peoples do not have a car. They never turn a light in their life. So this is injustice. We are in 21st centuries. So that must change by a small scale renewable energy in our communities that can help us to thrive.
There's no shortage of hypocrisy on climate issues. I think as a last question, I'd like to talk to you about the Davos World Economic Forum conference in Davos. You were there. While climate change was purportedly high on the agenda for this year's summit, it's also kind of the picture-perfect image of global inequality. Is it realistic to expect that any credible change will come from an event like that?
Davos have been very big on climate this year. Like the forum had 70% around the topics going on environment. That was fantastic. But when you just like turn and look at all the people around the room who are from the CEO, and you think about the profile that they wanted to make, so then for me, are they serious? So I cannot be sure about all the commitment in Davos until I see the action that they are doing on the ground. They are responsible. If they are really aware about what they have to take as decisions in Davos, they must do that on the ground and show us in the next forum in Davos.
Hundreds of millions of people, if not more, are waiting for those responses. Hindou Oumarou Ibrahim, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much for coming on the show today.
Great pleasure having me. Thank you.